Hello, police. Yeah, what's the problem, sir? We just drove down our farm track. Yeah. Go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it. Yeah. It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over them.
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case, or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. We will start with the finding of the bodies in the Range Rover. You will remember the first 2 witnesses, Kenneth Jiggins and Peter Theobald. Kenneth Jiggins has been a close friend of the farmer who farms White House Farm, Peter Theobald, for 25 years. He helps in the pheasant shoot and the duck shoot. Workhouse Lane at the time had a single metal gate across the track which led to the fields, the pond, the wood and further onto the farm. The gate was normally locked in the shooting season, which this was from mid-July to the end of February, in order to deter poachers. On the 6th of December 1995, Mr. Jiggins went around 4 in the afternoon to feed the pheasants and the ducks, but he only fed the ducks. It was too late for the pheasants. He drove back through the gateway and locked the gate at around 5 p.m. He thought the snow had just stopped and there was no other vehicle on the route. Next morning, the 7th of December at 7:45 a.m, he went to the yard and met Peter Theobald, and Peter Theobald drove him in the Land Rover down the track. Okay, so I'll cut in here quite early on because there's a few relevant details that have been mentioned, and I do get a lot of these questions quite frequently, so it's best to make sure that people understand exactly what is being said here. Now, the lane was last used by the farmer at 5 p.m. That is when he comes back through the gate, locks the gate and heads back to White House Farm. So theoretically, that lane was out of use from 5 p.m. onwards. Another important thing to mention is actually when this gate was normally locked, and that was during the shooting season. Now, if we look at Darren Nichols' version of events, this is where one of the earliest discrepancies arrives. He claims that after shooting was done, Michael Steele said to him in the car ride home, "I didn't know where Jack was. We got to the gate and the gate was locked. I thought the gate was going to be open. I had no idea where Jack was. I got out of the vehicle. Jack appeared from the bushes and just started shooting him." Now, it's clearly stated here that this gate is always locked between the months of mid-July to the end of February. How could anyone who was going to commit that crime have expected that gate to have been open and made plans for that gate to be open and to actually execute Tucker, Tate and Rolfe in that field beyond the locked gate? There was a lot of snow and ice over the puddles as they drove, and none of the ice had been broken. It was around 8 a.m. and they came across the blue Range Rover parked facing towards the gate. They stopped some 20 yards short of it. Mr. Jiggins went to the driver's side to ask whoever was inside to move so they could get through into the field. He tapped on the driver's window but did not look inside. It was because he got no response that he did then look through the window and saw what must have been the dreadful sight of the driver's head lying to one side of the window with blood coming from his nose and mouth. The front passenger's head was slumped forward and there was lots of blood to his head and chest. It was only the 2 bodies in the front that Mr. Jiggins noticed, and he called to Peter Theobald telling him what he had seen, mentioning only 2 people. Peter Theobald came down to the Range Rover, and as Mr. Jiggins was making a 999 call, Peter Theobald said, "There's one in the back as well." They got in their Land Rover, turned round, went back to the A130 to await the police, who had been called on the telephone. The police came after around 5 minutes and left their vehicle at the start of the track. All 4 men, the 2 police officers and the 2 farmers, walked back towards the top of the lane, but the 2 civilians did not go as far as the police officers and waited further down the track. Cross-examined by Mr. Parkins, Mr. Jiggins said that the A130 was a very busy road mornings and evenings, 7 to 9 in the morning, 4:45 until 6:30ish in the evening. He also said that courting couples used the track as a lover's lane. Oh, hello. There was a padlock on the gate for 6 to 9 months, replacing one that was lost, and there was a fishing syndicate of around 10 to 15 people who would have had several keys. There was a way to the gate from the other side, but you had to get there across a field. He looked at the photographs and said the tyre tracks looked fresh. Okay, so let's just cut in here briefly, as a few topics have been mentioned, and they are actually questions that I get asked on a quite frequent basis regarding this case. How many people had access to the gate? Well, clearly here there's around 10 to 15 people in the fishing syndicate, and there were several keys available for the locked gate. That doesn't exactly tell us how many keys there are, but there were several keys available for the 10 to 15 people who were involved in the fishing syndicate. Now, what you're going to hear from next is the tyre tracks which go beyond the locked gate. This is a sticking point for many regarding this case, as they believe that this shows another vehicle went through the gate and the gate was locked behind the Range Rover, etc., etc. But what you're going to hear is that the tracks beyond the gate were deeper than the ones where the Range Rover is parked, if that makes sense. And the reason that these tracks looked fresh was because they were deeper than the other tracks before it. You should be able to see this aerial photograph in front of you, which does give you a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about here. And also remember that we've just heard that the farmer drove his Land Rover across this field through the gate on the evening of their deaths. So it would have looked quite fresh, as the farmer himself used that track the evening of the deaths of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. Anyway, let's continue from where we left off. These are the ones the other side of the fence. The ruts on this field were deeper, and that is why they looked undisturbed. The first dark stretch was a deeper track. He looked at Exhibit 3, the map, and said that Rettendon Hall was on higher ground and had a view down into Workhouse Lane. The lane was fairly low down, and then the land rose up to Meadow Road. He did not see any signs of well-defined shoe prints. He did not walk around the Land Rover. His own Wellingtons were size 9, and they were taken from him by the police. He did not look for cartridge cases. Cross-examined by Mr. Lederman, he said that there was some snow on the morning of the 7th of December, and in certain parts there was fluffy snow and ice. In other parts that were sheltered, there was very little snow. Mr. Fearbold gave you similar evidence about the gate always being locked. He told you about going down on the morning of the 7th of December with Mr. Jiggins and getting to the Range Rover parked in front of the gate, and about Mr. Jiggins going to the driver's window, tapping on it, getting no response, calling to him, and he spoke of seeing the third body himself. Okay, so a few points worthy of mention during that short section, and we'll focus on the farmers themselves arriving at Workhouse Lane and discovering the bodies of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. So as Jiggins and Fearbold approach the small section of Workhouse Lane, the first section of the lane which leads down towards the Range Rover, they recall noticing that the puddles on that lane were undisturbed and they were covered with ice. So that can give us some sort of reassurance that the Range Rover had been there for some amount of time, or at least long enough for ice to form on those puddles and leave them looking undisturbed. As they've reached the Range Rover, they actually mention seeing some white fluffy snow around the Range Rover, but less snow around the more sort of covered areas. Now, by covered places, I can only assume that he's meaning the start of the lane, which is more protected from the elements. And I talked about this in some previous videos regarding the footprints that were left on the scene and the lack of footprints discovered or even really mentioned by anyone who attended the crime scene. There wasn't any legible footprints entering that first section of lane where Jack Holmes and Michael Steele were supposedly walking in order to get back to the getaway vehicle. But it's interesting to mention that there was a lack of snow, or certainly less snow in those areas, as I assumed, but yet no legible footprints or no footprints which really stood out were able to be recovered. He talked of the mobile phone being used and of them driving back to the A130 and then going off to feed the birds, but not using that same track. In cross-examination, he said all the shooting syndicate had keys, so there were 10 or a dozen keys to the locked gate. Okay, so we do actually get our answer there regarding how many keys were around or floating about for that locked gate, and that was around 10 to 12 keys available, which would have opened the locked gate in front of the Range Rover containing Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. Let's now continue from where we left off. The farmer had retreated from the Range Rover so as not to interfere with any marks. His own Wellington boots were taken in for examination. Their own vehicle had not been down the track after 7 p.m. on the previous evening. The next morning they had to defrost their own vehicle, but there was no snow or frost anywhere on the roof or the windscreen of the Range Rover, and also no steaming up of the interior. The farmer said he would have expected it to have been frosted up if it was there for many hours. In cross-examination by Mr. Rettendon, he said there was enough frost to need to defrost his own vehicle which had been parked since 5 p.m. the previous night at the farmyard, which was fairly open to the weather. Barry Knights, a police constable, and Sergeant Christopher Atkins were those first two officers who arrived in a police car at 8:17 a.m. They were there for around 5 hours. They saw and spoke to the two farmers, Mr. Theobald and Mr. Jiggins, and then walked down the track, which was a single vehicle route, which had around 2.5 centimetres or around an inch of snow on it. They saw what was obviously Mr. Jiggins' vehicle, which had made 2 tyre tracks down the track. As they rounded the right-hand bend, Mr. Knights immediately saw the Range Rover and later the registration F424 NPE. The officer asked Jiggins and Theobald to stop when they were 25 yards from the vehicle. The Range Rover was quite dirty and the only area he could see through was the rear windscreen wash and wipe. The gate was around 5 yards in front of the vehicle. He saw 2 bodies in the front seats and walked to the offside of the vehicle and saw 3 blue shotgun cartridges lying in the snow beside the driver's door. Mr. Knights walked around the rear of the vehicle and stood at the rear near side corner and saw a blue shotgun cartridge on the ground outside the rear passenger door. He could see the large wound clearly visible in the rear passenger's head, which was leaning against a broken window. After a brief conversation with Sergeant Atkins, it was Knights that was left by the scene by the others. Sergeant Atkins went to call for assistance from other police and stayed in a small turning off the track. It was his job to protect the crime scene and make sure that nobody approached until senior officers could assess the situation. He looked for a pattern of anyone walking down the lane, but there were no signs except for the vehicle going down. There were, however, points to indicate that people had been up to the scene. Atkins and he were very careful not to disturb anything and not to let things get trodden on. He tried not to tread on the footprints. His own boots were taken for testing, and he would have expected any footwear of anyone who went near the vehicle to have also been taken in for examination. Okay, so let's just interject here briefly. This just clarifies what I've said in previous videos. That this officer was stood there, he looked around for any sort of signs of anyone walking to that vehicle, anyone making a getaway on foot, anyone approaching this vehicle to commit the murder on foot, but there were no footprints at the crime scene. Now, someone left me a comment recently saying, well, could it have been that there were so many footprints they didn't know which ones were the gunman and they simply didn't bother taking any impressions of any of the footprints because there were simply too many. But that is not what is stated here in this court document. This is a summing up in court. So this is the most official version of events for how this crime was investigated. And clearly it states here that there were no footprints heading up to the vehicle or away from it. Now, it also does mention there that there was evidence to point that someone had been up to the scene. Well, obviously, that probably accounts for the farmers who originally discovered Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. So I wouldn't put too much emphasis on that part of the statement. Let's now continue from where we left off. This officer was the first person there, apart from the farmers. He could not define what footprints there were, but they were in different directions around the vehicle. He could not define who made them. To the rear of the vehicle and the offside, there were 2 marks he saw himself. He did not touch any of the cartridge cases. He only noticed the 3 on the offside and the 1 at the near side. He got bomb tape from his vehicle and put it down to make a track on one side. Nobody wandered down the track. He was in the turning area and he did not see anyone where he was. Okay, just to clarify what is being said there were footprints found in different directions around the vehicle, but he could not define who made them. This lends more credibility to there being the potential of footprints being left by the perpetrators and a second vehicle being used to make the getaway, and that's why we don't see any footprints entering or exiting the lane, but there are some footprints found around the vehicle itself. But we also need to account for the fact that the two farmers actually walked up to the vehicle, so there would have been footprints left by those two individuals. Let's now continue from where we left off. The officer involved said that he definitely would not have put his police boot near any cartridge that you see in those photographs. In re-examination, he told you that as the snow was melting, he informed the other officers further away of what was happening. They were at the A130, the end of the track. From his position, nobody could come past without his seeing it, and nobody did, whether a member of the public or a reporter or whatever. There, for the first time, members of the jury, you have an insight as to what was happening in the investigation. It was starting from the far end of the track down at the A130, and it was Mr. Knights who drew attention to the fact that the temperature was up because the snow was melting and things were changing. Sergeant Christopher Atkins had come down the track with Mr. Knights and had seen Mr. Jiggins and Mr. Theobald. When he looked at the Range Rover, he saw no obvious snow on the roof, and he saw the bodies of the individuals inside the vehicle. There was around an inch of snow on the track, but no snow in front of the vehicle, and the windows were not iced up. He went from the back driver's side to the driver's window, and then to the back, and then down the passenger side of the vehicle. He walked down the near side, and then went back to the track, and he put tape across the track, which you have seen and do not need to see again in photograph 5. Then PC Morris joined him, and they went down the track and kept a log of those attending at the A130. The officer said in cross-examination that it was the middle of a cold spell, and all vehicles out for a length of time would have had ice or snow on them. He had Doc Martin type boots, but not Doc Martens with a block pattern. He said, quote, "Once we were aware of what we'd got," meaning the site he had found in the Range Rover, "we were very careful of where we put our feet. There was quite a covering of snow at the time, around about an inch, and footmarks can be of valuable assistance." He walked halfway down the near side of the car and did not remember any cartridge case on the near side. He would have recorded it if he had. He was taking great care, bearing in mind what he was looking at, and he said there are 1,001 things going on in his mind at the time when looking inside the vehicle. Dr. Yankee Passard was the police surgeon. He first attended the scene at 9:30 a.m, but he did not see much at the time because he was kept back from the vehicle. He said it was a cold day and there was snow on the ground to around the thickness of a centimetre when he first arrived and frost on the ground. The weather at the time was overcast. He went nowhere near the scene on his first visit, but did so when he returned at 11:30, when he was escorted to the driver's side of the vehicle. He saw empty cartridges on the ground on the offside, which was the side from which he approached the vehicle. He was asked not to contaminate the scene by touching anything. He saw the bodies of the 3 men. He described the injuries he saw, which were afterwards more clearly described by the pathologist, and so I will save that description for then. He saw that the glass from the near side window was shattered. He thought that the gunshot wounds appeared to have caused massive disruptions to the skulls of the 3 victims, and he certified them as dead. Okay, so I'll just cut in here. Now, this is obviously when the first medical professional arrives at the crime scene at 9:30. Interestingly, he is kept back from the actual vehicle for 2 hours until 11:30. Now, really, this was the first person who could have tried to have ascertained some sort of time of death, but he was told by the officers on scene not to touch anything from basically fear of contamination. Let's now continue with the next part. In cross-examination, he said he walked behind Superintendent Dibley to the crime scene, and Mr. Dibley guided him. He believes he saw 4 cartridge cases. He thought those were to the offside of the vehicle, but he could not be sure. He was clear in his mind, however, that he saw 1 cartridge case away from the vehicle. Then it was asked about the time of death. He said there are various methods to ascertain the time of death, which you needed to be an expert, and it is sometimes fraught with difficulty. He did not take the body temperatures or take any active steps because there was a danger of contamination of the bodies. He did not know what an expert would do to estimate the time of death, and he did not make his own estimation. DC Peter King attended the scene at around 20 to 11 and took a number of photographs that we have just been looking at. Okay, so I'll just cut in here briefly, because this gives us an idea of when the first crime scene photographs were actually taken. When you look at these crime scene photographs, the first thing that goes on in your mind more than likely is that this is what the scene would have looked like when the farmers found the vehicle, when the first responding officers saw the dead bodies and saw the crime scene, etc. But this is quite a few hours later. We're looking at nearly midday here when the first lot of crime scene photographs were actually taken. Let's now continue from where we left off. At 7:45 in the evening at the scenes of crime garage at South Woodham Ferris Police Station, he took a further set of photographs showing the three deceased inside the vehicle. If you would like to learn more about the Range Rover murders, then click on the video in front of you now. You will also see the Essex Boys playlist, which has all of the videos concerning this case in one convenient folder. Many thanks for joining me for this video. I look forward to seeing you all again for the next one. Take care. Cheers.